December 14th, 1943, 26,000 feet above Kiel, Germany. Hauptmann Klaus Fischer watched through his canopy as formations of American B-17 flying fortresses turned for home after bombing the U-boat pens. His Messerschmitt Bf 109 idled at combat power, waiting for the moment every Luftwaffe pilot knew would come. The escorts would break off. They always did. For 2 years, the mathematics of aerial warfare over occupied Europe had been brutally simple. American fighters possessed neither the fuel capacity nor the range to protect their bombers deep into German territory. Fischer and his pilots from WWII 26 had learned to exploit this fundamental limitation with predatory patience. They would shadow the bomber streams, enduring the defensive fire from hundreds of 50-caliber machine guns, waiting for the inevitable moment when the escorting Thunderbolts and Lightnings reached their fuel limits and turned back toward England. That was when the killing began. Fischer keyed his radio, preparing to order the attack, but something was wrong. The fighter escorts were not turning back. Silver-nosed P-51 Mustangs, aircraft he recognized from intelligence briefings but had never encountered over German airspace, maintained their positions above and around the bomber formations. He checked his chronometer. The Americans had been over German territory for 47 minutes. No Allied fighter had ever stayed this long. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The Mustangs continued their protective weave around the bombers, their pilots clearly unconcerned about fuel consumption that should have been forcing them home. Fischer's wingman, Oberleutnant Hans Kruger, voiced what they were all thinking. They cannot have the range to stay here. It is impossible. But the impossible was happening before their eyes. For the first time since the strategic bombing campaign began, American fighters were escorting their bombers throughout the entire mission profile. The tactical doctrine that had governed aerial warfare over Europe for 2 years was being rewritten in real time, and Luftwaffe pilots, who had grown confident through months of successful attacks against unescorted bombers, suddenly faced a reality their training had never prepared them to handle. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The war over Europe's skies had evolved through brutal lessons paid for in blood and burning aluminum. When the 8th Air Force began its strategic bombing campaign in 1942, American commanders believed their heavily armed B-17 and B-24 bombers could defend themselves through massed defensive fire. The combat box formation, where dozens of bombers flew in tight coordination, created overlapping fields of fire that theoretically would destroy any attacking fighter before it could deliver a killing blow. Theory collapsed upon contact with German reality. Luftwaffe pilots, many of them veterans of campaigns from Poland to Britain, had developed tactics specifically designed to defeat massed bomber formations. They would attack head-on, closing speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour, firing through the narrowest window of defensive fire before breaking away. Or they would position themselves above the formations, diving through with enough speed to make accurate defensive fire nearly impossible. The casualty statistics became unsustainable. Of every 100 heavy bombers that crossed into German airspace during the summer of 1943, 25 would not return. Young men climbed into their aircraft knowing the mathematical probability of their own deaths better than they knew the faces of their squadron mates, because those faces changed too frequently to memorize. General Ira Eker, commanding the 8th Air Force from his headquarters in England, understood that the bombing campaign would fail unless American fighters could escort the bombers throughout their missions. But the fighters available in 1943 simply lacked the range. The P-47 Thunderbolt, despite its impressive firepower and rugged construction, could escort bombers only to the German border before fuel limitations forced it to turn back. The P-38 Lightning possessed greater range, but lacked the high-altitude performance necessary to engage German interceptors effectively at the altitudes where bomber formations operated. The Germans exploited this limitation with systematic efficiency. Major Gerhard Schöpfel, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced fighter leaders, had refined the tactic of shadowing American formations until the escorts departed. His pilots from WWII 26 would position themselves just outside the effective range of bomber defensive guns, tracking the formations across the North Sea and into German airspace. Radio operators on the ground provided continuous updates on escort positions, allowing the German fighters to time their attacks precisely for the moment when American bombers became vulnerable. The psychological impact on bomber crews was devastating. They would watch their fighter escorts waggle their wings in farewell, turning back toward England, knowing that German fighters had been watching and waiting for exactly this moment. The next 30 to 40 minutes, flying deep into German territory without fighter protection, became a gauntlet of terror where survival depended more on luck than skill or courage. Major Klaus Fischer had perfected these tactics through 18 months of combat over occupied Europe. He had learned to read American bomber formations, the way a hunter reads tracks, identifying which aircraft were damaged, which formations were losing cohesion, which bomber streams would make the easiest targets. His 63 confirmed victories included 41 heavy bombers, massive four-engine aircraft that required precise gunnery and absolute commitment to destroy before their defensive fire could kill the attacker. Fischer's success derived from understanding the fundamental advantage German fighters possessed: operational flexibility within their own territory. His Messerschmitt Bf-109s could be vectored by ground radar to intercept bomber streams at any point along their routes. When fuel ran low, German pilots could land at any of dozens of airfields scattered across occupied Europe, refuel quickly, and return to battle. The Americans enjoyed no such luxury. Every gallon of fuel consumed over enemy territory was a gallon that could not be used for the return flight to England. The industrial reality behind these tactical advantages was equally important. German aircraft factories produced approximately 1,500 single-engine fighters per month by mid-1943. Losses could be replaced quickly, and damaged aircraft could be repaired at facilities spread throughout the Reich. The Luftwaffe's logistics system, refined through 4 years of war, could keep fighter units operational even under the pressure of sustained combat. But intelligence reports reaching Luftwaffe headquarters during the autumn of 1943 contained troubling information. American fighter production was accelerating dramatically. New aircraft designs were entering service. Most concerning were reports about a fighter designated the P-51 Mustang, originally developed for the British Royal Air Force, but now being adopted by American air forces in large numbers. The initial intelligence assessments dismissed the Mustang as strategically irrelevant. It was powered by the Packard-built Merlin engine, the same power plant used in the Spitfire, and intelligence officers calculated that even with external fuel tanks, the aircraft could not possess sufficient range to escort bombers to targets deep in Germany. The Mustang might extend escort coverage by 50 or 60 miles beyond what Thunderbolts could achieve, but this modest improvement would not fundamentally alter the tactical balance. These calculations were based on conventional assumptions about fighter fuel consumption and operational doctrine. German engineers understood that long-range fighters required either massive internal fuel tanks that compromised performance or external tanks that created drag and made aircraft vulnerable during combat. Either solution seemed to present tactical compromises that would offset any range advantages. What German intelligence failed to anticipate was that American engineers had solved the fundamental problem differently. The P-51's laminar flow wing design reduced drag to levels that German aerodynamicists had considered theoretically possible but practically unachievable. The Packard Merlin engine, while consuming fuel at rates similar to German power plants, delivered this power with an efficiency that extended operational range beyond anything Luftwaffe pilots had encountered. Most critically, the Mustang could carry external drop tanks that, once emptied, could be jettisoned before combat. This allowed the aircraft to extend its range dramatically during the cruise portions of a mission, then fight with performance characteristics uncompromised by external stores. The concept was not new, but the P-51's aerodynamic efficiency made it devastatingly effective in ways that previous attempts at long-range escort fighters had not achieved. The first P-51 Mustang groups began arriving in England during the late autumn of 1943. The 354th Fighter Group, equipped with P-51Bs, completed their training and prepared for operational missions. American planners understood they possessed a potential war-winning capability, but the doctrine for employing long-range escorts remained uncertain. Fighter pilots, trained for aggressive pursuit of enemy aircraft, would need to resist their instincts and remain with the bombers they were protecting, even when German fighters attempted to lure them away. The tactical challenge facing American escort pilots was psychologically difficult. Every instinct developed through training emphasized offensive action, pursuing and destroying enemy fighters wherever they could be found. But effective bomber escort required defensive discipline, staying close to the formations being protected even when German fighters presented tempting targets just beyond engagement range. Lieutenant Colonel James Howard, commanding the 356th Fighter Squadron, understood that this mission would test his pilots' discipline as much as their flying skills. During briefings at Boxted Airfield in Essex, he emphasized the primary objective with repetitive insistence. "We are not hunting German fighters. We are protecting our bombers. If the Germans want to fight, they will have to come through us. But we do not leave the great bombers to chase them." The ground crews servicing the Mustangs worked through cold December nights, installing the external drop tanks that would make the extended range possible. Each aircraft carried two 108-gallon tanks mounted under the wings, supplementing the internal fuel capacity of 184 gallons. The mathematics were straightforward but revolutionary. With careful fuel management, the Mustangs could accompany bomber formations to targets 500 miles from their English bases, fight for 10 to 15 minutes over the target area, and return home with fuel reserves. German radar operators tracking the December 14th mission noted the composition of the American formations as they crossed the Dutch coast. The bomber stream included over 500 B-17 seconds targeting industrial facilities at Bremen and Kiel. The escort consisted of approximately 200 fighters, including Thunderbolts that would cover the penetration to the German border, and Mustangs that appeared on radar tracks but whose capabilities remained uncertain to German controllers. Major Fischer received his scramble order at 10:43 hours local time. His Jagdgeschwader 26 was positioned at Woensdrecht Airfield in the Netherlands, ideally located to intercept bomber streams approaching the German heartland. 12 Bf-109s lifted off and climbed to altitude, joining other Luftwaffe formations being vectored toward the American bombers by ground controllers who tracked the raid's progress across their plotting tables. The interception geometry was perfect. Fischer's formation reached combat altitude northeast of Bremen, positioning themselves up-sun from the approaching bombers. He could see the American formations clearly, their silver wings catching the weak December sunlight, vapor trails streaming behind them as they maintained their relentless progress toward targets that had seemed invulnerable just months earlier. But the escorts were still there, not just a few fighters making a token presence, but substantial numbers of Mustangs maintaining protective formations around the bombers. Fischer checked his fuel state and calculated timing. The Americans had been over German territory for nearly 50 minutes. Standard doctrine said the escorts should have turned back 15 minutes ago, yet they showed no signs of departing. Oberleutnant Kruger's voice carried the frustration shared by every German pilot watching this impossible situation unfold. What fuel do they carry? How can they stay? Fischer had no answer. He ordered his formation to maintain position, waiting for the moment when the American fighters would inevitably have to leave. But that moment never came. The Mustangs stayed with their bombers all the way to the target area, through the flak-filled skies over Bremen where anti-aircraft fire destroyed formation integrity, and then, during the withdrawal when damaged bombers fell behind and became the easiest targets. The few attacks Fischer's unit attempted against the bomber formations were met by Mustangs that appeared with startling speed, forcing the German fighters to break off or risk being engaged at a tactical disadvantage. The American escort pilots were not being drawn away from their charges. They maintained their defensive discipline, staying close to the bombers, even when German fighters presented themselves as seemingly vulnerable targets. For the first time in 2 years of aerial warfare over Europe, a significant bomber mission penetrated deep into German territory and returned to England without suffering catastrophic losses from fighter attacks. The 8th Air Force lost 19 bombers that day, most to anti-aircraft fire rather than fighter action. Under previous operational conditions, losses would have exceeded 50 aircraft. The mission of December 14, 1943, was not a single dramatic turning point, but rather the visible emergence of a capability that would reshape the entire character of the air war. American fighters could now escort their bombers throughout complete mission profiles. The sanctuaries of time and distance that had protected German industry were disappearing, and Luftwaffe pilots who had hunted American bombers with near impunity now faced escorts that could match their performance while possessing range capabilities that seemed to defy every known limitation of fighter aircraft. The interrogation room at Luftwaffe headquarters in Berlin smelled of cigarette smoke and institutional coffee as Oberst Adolf Galland, general of the fighter arm, reviewed the mission reports from December 14th. The veteran pilot who had scored 104 aerial victories before assuming his administrative role read the accounts with growing concern that bordered on disbelief. Multiple experienced squadron commanders reported identical observations. American escort fighters, maintaining station with bomber formations throughout missions that should have exhausted their fuel supplies. Galland summoned Major Fischer to Berlin for personal debriefing. The two men sat across a scarred wooden table covered with maps and intelligence photographs, while Fischer described what he had witnessed over Bremen. The Americans were over our territory for 1 hour and 17 minutes from coast crossing to coast departure. Their fighters never left the bombers. We waited for them to turn back. They did not turn back. The implications were immediately clear to Galland, who understood aerial warfare with the clarity that came from having fought in it personally for 4 years. If American fighters could escort bombers throughout complete mission profiles, the defensive strategy that had made strategic bombing costly and partially ineffective would collapse. German fighters would have to fight through American escorts to reach the bombers, accepting combat on terms that neutralized the tactical advantages Luftwaffe pilots had exploited since 1941. Intelligence officers presented their analysis of the American fighter that had made this impossible achievement possible. The P-51 Mustang, they explained, combined 3 revolutionary characteristics that previous long-range fighter attempts had failed to achieve simultaneously. First, exceptional aerodynamic efficiency through its laminar flow wing design reduced drag to levels that extended range without compromising performance. Second, the Packard Merlin engine provided reliable power with fuel consumption characteristics that, while not exceptional by themselves, became devastating when combined with the airframe's efficiency. Third, the aircraft could carry substantial external fuel loads that, once consumed, could be jettisoned before combat. What made the Mustang truly dangerous was that these characteristics did not represent extreme engineering compromises in other areas. The Mustang aircraft could fight effectively after completing long-range cruise profiles. Its top speed exceeded 430 miles per hour at altitude. Its rate of climb allowed it to engage German fighters on roughly equal terms. The armament of 650 caliber machine guns delivered sufficient firepower to destroy enemy aircraft quickly. Galland studied the specifications with the analytical mind of an engineer and the tactical awareness of a combat veteran. He recognized immediately that Germany possessed no equivalent capability and, more critically, lacked the industrial capacity to develop one quickly enough to matter. German fighter development had focused on increasing performance through more powerful engines and heavier armament, accepting reduced range as an acceptable compromise for fighters operating over their own territory. The assumption that fighters would always operate within range of their bases had been reasonable when Germany controlled most of Europe. American bombers struggled to reach even the closest German targets, but the strategic situation had evolved faster than German aircraft development could adapt. American industrial capacity was now producing bombers in such quantities that even catastrophic loss rates could be sustained, while simultaneously developing escort fighters that eliminated the vulnerability window German tactics had exploited. Major Gerhard Schöpfel, called to Berlin for similar debriefing, provided additional tactical intelligence that painted an even grimmer picture. His pilots from Jagdgeschwader 26 had engaged American Mustangs on multiple occasions during late December and early January. The results were sobering. German fighters could no longer simply position themselves and wait for escorts to depart. They had to fight through the escorts to reach bombers, and the Mustang pilots were proving to be well-trained, disciplined, and operating aircraft that matched or exceeded German fighter capabilities in most performance parameters. The psychological impact on our pilots is significant, Schöpfel reported with characteristic directness. For 2 years, we have attacked American bombers, knowing that patience would eventually leave them vulnerable. Now we must accept combat when and where the Americans choose, with no guarantee that we can disengage if the tactical situation becomes unfavorable. We are losing experienced pilots in combat that produces marginal results, even when successful. The human dimension of this strategic shift became visible in pilot replacement rates and unit effectiveness assessments. Luftwaffe fighter units that had maintained operational readiness above 80% during 1943 saw this figure drop steadily as combat over Germany intensified during the winter months. Experienced pilots, the core of Luftwaffe effectiveness, were being lost faster than training programs could replace them with equivalently skilled aviators. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Lieutenant Werner Goerth, a 22-year-old pilot with 7 months of operational experience, recorded his impressions in a letter to his family that Luftwaffe sensors would intercept but not suppress, recognizing that the observations reflected widespread concerns rather than defeatist propaganda. We fought against American bombers again today. Their escorts stayed with them even over our airfields. 3 of our squadron did not return. The Americans seem to have unlimited numbers of aircraft and pilots, while we struggle to replace losses with adequately trained replacements. I wonder how long we can continue this. The tactical adjustments German fighter units implemented revealed the depth of the problem they faced. Fighter controllers began positioning units to intercept American formations earlier in their missions, attempting to engage before the bombers reached their targets, and while German pilots still possessed fuel advantages from operating closer to their bases. But this strategy required predicting bomber routes accurately, and American planners countered by varying their approach paths and using feint formations to draw German fighters out of position. Hauptmann Josef Priller, an ace with 101 victories commanding Jagdgeschwader 26, experimented with aggressive head-on attacks against bomber formations, accepting the risk of collision in exchange for avoiding prolonged combat with escort fighters. The tactic produced some successes, but at unsustainable cost. Head-on attacks required precise timing and nerve that exhausted even experienced pilots, while the closing speeds made accurate gunnery extremely difficult. More critically, American escort fighters learned to position themselves to intercept German fighters during their approach runs, forcing combat before the attackers could reach the bombers. The industrial response from German aircraft manufacturers revealed how completely the range problem had been overlooked during fighter development. Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf engineering teams proposed modifications to existing fighter designs that might extend range through additional fuel tanks or more efficient engines. But these modifications involved fundamental redesigns that would require months of development and testing, followed by production retooling that would temporarily reduce fighter output at precisely the moment when Germany needed maximum production. Professor Kurt Tank, chief designer at Focke-Wulf, submitted proposals for a long-range escort fighter that could match the Mustang's capabilities. The design studies showed promise, but Tank's realistic assessment of development timelines acknowledged that such an aircraft could not enter service before late 1945 at the earliest. The war would not wait for German engineering to catch up with American innovation. Reich Minister Albert Speer, responsible for armaments production, received increasingly urgent requests from the Luftwaffe for resources to accelerate fighter development and production. His response revealed the impossible choices facing German war economy by early 1944. Fighter production could be increased only by diverting resources from other critical programs, including tank production, submarine construction, and synthetic fuel manufacturing. Each of these programs had its own advocates, who argued, with equal validity, that their requirements were essential for German survival. The fuel situation created additional complications that Mustang range advantages exacerbated indirectly. German fighters required high-octane aviation gasoline to deliver their rated performance, but Allied bombing of synthetic fuel plants was steadily reducing available supplies. By February 1944, Luftwaffe units faced fuel allocations that limited training flights for new pilots, while simultaneously restricting the number of fighters that could be scrambled to meet any single raid. The Americans could afford to escort every bomber mission with hundreds of fighters. Germany had to carefully ration fighter sorties, choosing which raids to oppose in strength and which to allow through with only token resistance. Major Fisher faced these realities daily as he led his squadron against American formations that grew larger and more heavily escorted with each passing week. On March 6, 1944, his unit was scrambled to intercept a massive raid against Berlin, the first time American heavy bombers had struck the Reich capital in daylight. Over 600 B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds approached the city, escorted by nearly 800 fighters including Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Lightnings. The scale of the American effort was overwhelming. Fisher's 12 Bf-109s joined approximately 400 German fighters attempting to defend Berlin, but the tactical mathematics were brutally unfavorable. For every German fighter, there were 2 American escorts, and those escorts no longer had to conserve fuel for the return flight. They could engage aggressively, pursuing German fighters that attempted to disengage, maintaining combat until the Germans either stood and fought or fled to altitudes where their aircraft performance deteriorated. The battle over Berlin on March 6 lasted approximately 40 minutes and represented one of the largest aerial engagements of the entire war. German fighters attempted every tactic they had developed over 4 years of combat. They made massed head-on attacks against bomber formations. They dove from superior altitude through fighter screens. They positioned themselves in the bomber stream's path and maintained station, forcing American formations to fly through their fire. Nothing worked with decisive effectiveness. Fisher shot down 2 B-17 seconds that morning, adding to his victory total in the methodical way that had characterized his entire combat career. But his squadron lost 5 aircraft, including 3 pilots killed and 2 wounded seriously enough to be removed from operational status. The exchange rate, measured in cold statistical terms, was unsustainable. Germany was losing experienced fighter pilots faster than training programs could replace them, while American bomber and fighter strength continued increasing with industrial momentum that seemed unstoppable. Oberleutnant Kruger, Fisher's wingman, was among the casualties from the Berlin mission. His Bf-109 was hit by fire from a P-51 during a diving attack against a bomber formation. The Messerschmitt's fuel tank ignited, and Kruger had only seconds to exit the burning aircraft. He survived with severe burns that would keep him hospitalized for months, ending his combat career at age 24 with 31 victories and injuries that would affect him for the remainder of his life. The personal loss affected Fisher deeply, but his mission reports maintained the professional detachment expected of Luftwaffe officers. Engaged enemy heavy bomber formation at 26,000 feet. Destroyed 2 B-17 aircraft confirmed. Own losses: 5 aircraft destroyed, 3 pilots killed, 2 wounded. Enemy escort fighters present in overwhelming numbers throughout engagement. They possessed sufficient fuel reserves to maintain combat for entire duration of action. Recommend tactical doctrine revision to address escort fighter range capabilities that exceed our previous assessments. The recommendation went nowhere because Luftwaffe commanders had no tactical solutions to offer. The fundamental problem was industrial and strategic, not tactical. Germany lacked the aircraft, the pilots, and the fuel to contest American air superiority over the Reich. And the Mustang's range capability had removed the final advantage that had made defense possible. Intelligence analysts studying captured Mustang drop tanks attempted to understand how such simple devices could provide such decisive strategic advantages. The tanks themselves were unremarkable, simple metal containers with basic fuel transfer systems, but the Mustang's aerodynamic efficiency meant that even with the drag penalty from carrying external tanks, the aircraft could cruise at speeds and altitudes that German fighters struggled to match while similarly burdened. Dr. Heinrich Wagner, chief of the Luftwaffe's Technical Development Office, submitted a report that acknowledged German aviation had been fundamentally outmaneuvered by American engineering. The P-51 represents not a single breakthrough, but rather the successful integration of multiple incremental advantages into a system that exceeds the sum of its parts. The laminar flow wing provides exceptional efficiency. The Merlin engine delivers reliable power with good fuel economy. The external tank system extends range without permanently compromising performance. Individually, none of these features are revolutionary. Combined, they create a capability we cannot currently match or effectively counter. The report concluded with recommendations that were effectively admissions of defeat in the technical competition. Germany should focus on producing larger numbers of existing fighter designs rather than attempting to develop competitors to the Mustang. Jet fighter development should be accelerated as the only potential technical response that might restore German performance advantages. Pilot training should emphasize survival and disengagement tactics rather than aggressive pursuit, acknowledging that Luftwaffe fighters were increasingly outmatched by combined American numerical and technical superiority. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, rejected these recommendations with the bombastic denial of reality that characterized his leadership during the war's final years. He insisted that German fighters were superior to American aircraft, and that any failures were due to insufficient pilot courage rather than technical inadequacies. This willful blindness to obvious reality prevented the Luftwaffe from making even the limited adaptations that might have reduced the catastrophic effectiveness of American strategic bombing. The psychological impact on German fighter pilots manifested in ways that affected combat effectiveness beyond simple statistical measurements. Lieutenant Werner Goeth's diary entries from March and April 1944 documented the mental toll of fighting an apparently unwinnable battle. "We take off, knowing the Americans will outnumber us. Their fighters escort their bombers all the way to targets we thought were beyond their reach. When we attack, they are there. When we attempt to disengage, they pursue us. Our experienced pilots are dying, and the replacements have perhaps 30 hours of flight, training before facing combat." The training crisis that Goeth identified had become acute by spring 1944. Pre-war Luftwaffe pilot training had required approximately 250 hours of flight time before operational assignment. By mid-1944, fuel shortages and training aircraft losses had reduced this to fewer than 100 hours for many replacement pilots. These inadequately trained aviators were thrown into combat against American pilots, who typically had over 300 hours of training and were flying aircraft that matched or exceeded German fighters in most performance categories. The morning of April 17, 1944, brought clear skies over central Germany, and with them another maximum effort from the 8th Air Force. Major Klaus Fischer stood beside his Messerschmitt Bf 109 at Hildesheim Airfield, watching mechanics complete pre-flight preparations, while his mind calculated odds that grew worse with each passing week. His squadron had been reduced to 8 operational aircraft from the authorized strength of 12, and 3 of his pilots were flying their first combat missions after training programs that Fischer considered criminally inadequate. The target that day was ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, installations that American planners believed were critical to German war production. The bomber stream included over 500 heavy bombers, and intelligence reports indicated escort strength approaching 700 fighters. Fischer's 8 aircraft would join perhaps 300 other German fighters attempting to defend against this armada, and everyone involved understood the futility of the numerical equation. The scramble order came at 11:20 hours local time. Fischer's formation climbed to 28,000 feet and positioned themselves northeast of the target area, hoping to intercept bomber formations after they had completed their bombing runs and dispersed their formations. This timing might allow attacks against isolated bombers that had fallen behind due to battle damage or mechanical problems, traditional prey for German interceptors, but the Mustang escorts had adapted their tactics to protect even these vulnerable stragglers. Fischer watched through his canopy as damaged B-17 seconds, trailing smoke and losing altitude, were shepherded by pairs or flights of P-51 seconds that stayed with them even as the main formations withdrew toward England. The American pilots had clearly been instructed that protecting damaged bombers was as important as defending the main force, and they possessed the fuel reserves to execute this mission throughout the bomber's withdrawal. Fisher attempted an attack against a B-17 that had dropped 3,000 feet below its formation, its No. 3 engine feathered and trailing thin smoke. Two Mustangs immediately positioned themselves between the German fighters and their intended target, forcing Fisher to either accept combat with the escorts or break off the attack. He chose to engage, hoping his experience advantage over what appeared to be relatively young American pilots might produce a quick victory that would allow subsequent attack on the bomber. The engagement lasted perhaps 4 minutes and demonstrated every disadvantage German fighters now faced in combat over the Reich. The Mustangs refused to be drawn away from their charge, maintaining position between Fisher's formation and the damaged bomber, while forcing the German fighters to maneuver defensively. When Fisher attempted to disengage by diving away, one of the Mustangs pursued him down to 15,000 feet before breaking off and climbing back to rejoin his wingman. The American pilot's fuel reserves allowed this aggressive pursuit without compromising his primary mission of protecting the bomber. Fisher would have been forced to conserve fuel for return to base, limiting his tactical options. This simple reality, the Mustang's ability to fight without constantly monitoring fuel state, while German pilots could not, represented perhaps the most fundamental tactical advantage the American fighters possessed. Fisher returned to Hildesheim with his squadron intact, but having accomplished nothing militarily significant. One of his new pilots, Unteroffizier Paul Steiner, had nearly been shot down during his first combat engagement, saved only by Fisher's intervention when the inexperienced pilot became fixated on a bomber and failed to notice a Mustang positioning for a killing shot. The debriefing after the mission was brief and dispiriting. No victories claimed, no bombers damaged. 8 aircraft returned safely, but operational readiness reduced when Steiner's fighter was found to have sustained minor damage from defensive fire. The statistical accumulation of such inconclusive missions was destroying the Luftwaffe's fighter force through simple attrition. German fighters were flying multiple sorties per day against American raids that arrived in relentless succession. Aircraft were being damaged faster than repair facilities could restore them to service. Pilots were being exhausted by the physical and psychological stress of continuous combat against overwhelming odds. Most critically, the experienced pilots who formed the core of Luftwaffe effectiveness were dying or being wounded at rates that made their eventual elimination mathematically certain. Hauptmann Heinz Nock, commanding a fighter squadron at Oldenburg, documented this inexorable decline in his diary, with observations that mixed professional military analysis with personal despair. "We are fighting the bravest fight imaginable, but we are losing. The Americans come every day with more bombers and more fighters than we possess in total. Their escorts stay with them from England to targets deep in Germany and back again. When we attack, they are there. Pursue us. Our pilots are dying or being wounded, and the replacements have barely learned to fly, much less fight." The Luftwaffe's command structure responded to these realities with increasingly desperate tactical innovations that reflected institutional recognition that conventional approaches had failed. Sturmgruppen, assault groups equipped with heavily armed and armored fighters, were formed to make massed attacks against bomber formations, accepting higher casualties in exchange for potentially devastating results. These units flew FW-190A models fitted with additional armor plating and 4 30mm cannons that could destroy a B-17 with a single accurate burst. The Sturmgruppen achieved some notable successes during spring and summer 1944, but their heavily laden aircraft were vulnerable to the Mustang escorts that inevitably appeared when they attempted to close with bomber formations. The additional armor that protected pilots from bomber defensive fire made the fighters less maneuverable in combat with enemy escorts. The 30mm cannons were devastating against bombers, but had low muzzle velocities that made them difficult to aim accurately against maneuvering fighter targets. Major Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, younger brother of Adolf Galland and an experienced fighter leader himself, commanded one of the first Sturmgruppen operations against American bombers in May 1944. His after-action report captured both the tactical potential and the practical limitations of the concept. We achieved initial surprise and destroyed 4 B-17 seconds in our first attack, but American escort fighters engaged us immediately afterward, and we lost 3 aircraft attempting to break contact. The heavily armed and armored fighters that give us advantages against bombers become liabilities when forced to fight enemy escorts that can match our performance while carrying sufficient fuel to maintain prolonged combat. The personal cost of these operations was severe. Oberleutnant Walther Dahl, a pilot in Gallen's unit, was shot down by a P-51 during his 3rd Sturmgruppen mission. He survived with injuries that required 3 months of hospitalization, during which time he watched 12 of his squadron mates die in similar operations. His memoirs, written decades after the war, reflected on the mathematical hopelessness that characterized German fighter operations during 1944. We knew we were losing. Every pilot understood the odds. But we continued fighting because surrender was not an option we could consider, and because we held some desperate hope that our sacrifice might delay American victory long enough for some technological miracle to save Germany. The technological miracles that German propaganda promised and that some pilots genuinely believed might materialize never arrived in sufficient numbers to matter. The Me-262 jet fighter, potentially capable of speeds that would make it invulnerable to Allied escorts, entered service in tiny numbers too late to affect the strategic situation. The losses required to protect the jet's vulnerable takeoffs and landings often exceeded the victories the jets achieved once airborne. The fuel required to operate jets was in even shorter supply than the high-octane gasoline needed for conventional fighters. By June 1944, the Allied invasion of Normandy created an additional crisis that drew Luftwaffe fighters away from Reich defense to support ground forces fighting desperately to contain the Allied beachhead. This dispersal of already inadequate fighter strength meant that bomber raids against German industry increasingly met only token resistance. Major Fischer found his unit transferred to northern France, where instead of intercepting strategic bombers, he and his pilots flew ground attack missions against Allied forces that possessed overwhelming air superiority. The personal trajectory that carried Fischer from confident hunter of American bombers in late 1943 to desperate ground attack pilot in summer 1944 mirrored the Luftwaffe's institutional collapse. His victory total had increased to 71, including 53 heavy bombers, making him one of the most successful anti-bomber specialists in the Luftwaffe. But these victories had been achieved at the cost of his entire original squadron. Of the 12 pilots he had commanded in December 1943, only he and 1 other survived by July 1944. The rest were dead, permanently injured, or missing in action. Lieutenant Werner Goerth, whose diary had documented the growing hopelessness of fighter operations, died on July 4, 1944, when his Bf 109 was shot down by a P-51 during combat over Magdeburg. He was 22 years old and had survived 8 months of operational flying, longer than most replacement pilots managed during the final year of the war. His last diary entry, written the evening before his final mission, contained observations that were found in his personal effects and eventually reached his family. Tomorrow we fly again. The Americans will come with their bombers and their long-range escorts. We will do what we can, which is never enough. I wonder if my death will mean anything to anyone except my family. The statistical analysis that American intelligence conducted throughout 1944 documented the complete reversal of aerial combat dynamics over Europe. During the first half of 1943, before long-range escort capabilities were fully developed, American bomber losses averaged 20% per mission on deep penetration raids into Germany. By the second half of 1944, with Mustangs providing complete escort coverage, bomber losses averaged less than 3% per mission. This reduction represented thousands of American lives saved and industrial targets destroyed that would have been spared if German fighters had maintained their earlier effectiveness. The German fighter force losses during the same period were catastrophic. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 1,000 fighter pilots killed or missing during the first 6 months of 1944 alone, losses that could not be replaced with equivalently trained or experienced aviators. Aircraft losses exceeded 2,000 fighters destroyed, approximately equivalent to the Luftwaffe's entire operational fighter strength at the beginning of the year. Production of new fighters actually increased during this period, but the aircraft were increasingly flown by inadequately trained pilots who survived an average of fewer than 10 combat missions. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, a fighter leader with 176 victories who would survive the war to become a post-war Luftwaffe commander, later reflected on the period when American long-range escorts eliminated German tactical advantages. The Mustang changed everything. Before it appeared in numbers, we could wait for the escorts to leave and then attack the bombers. After the Mustang arrived, there was no waiting period. The escorts stayed, and we had to fight through them to reach the bombers. This was a battle we could not win through superior tactics or pilot skill. The Americans had more aircraft, more pilots, and now fighters that could stay with their bombers anywhere over Europe. The final admission of defeat in the air superiority battle came not from combat pilots, but from Luftwaffe command staff who recognized that tactical adaptations could not overcome fundamental strategic disadvantages. General Adolf Galland submitted a comprehensive assessment to Hermann Göring in September 1944 that acknowledged the Mustang's range capability had been decisive in achieving American air superiority. The enemy's long-range escort fighters possess operational capabilities that we cannot match with existing aircraft or tactics. They accompany bomber formations throughout complete mission profiles, eliminating the vulnerability windows our fighters exploited successfully during 1943. Combined with numerical superiority and adequate pilot training, these range capabilities have given the Americans decisive advantages in the struggle for air supremacy over the Reich. Göring's response to Galland's assessment was characteristically delusional, blaming fighter pilots for insufficient courage, rather than acknowledging the material and technical realities that made effective defense impossible. This denial of obvious facts represented the institutional bankruptcy that characterized German leadership during the war's final phase, when realistic assessment of Germany's position might have led to negotiated peace that would have spared hundreds of thousands of lives on all sides. Major Klaus Fischer survived the war, flying his last combat mission on April 25, 1945, days before German surrender. His final victory total reached 79, making him one of the Luftwaffe's most successful anti-bomber specialists. But in post-war interviews, he consistently emphasized that individual success meant nothing in the context of strategic defeat. We lost the air war when American escorts could stay with their bombers throughout entire missions. Everything else, all our tactics and courage and sacrifice, became irrelevant when that fundamental advantage was lost. The Mustang's range capability was not just a technical achievement, it was the decisive factor that allowed America to destroy German industry and ensure Allied victory. The technical assessments that Allied intelligence teams conducted after the war, examining German aviation documents and interviewing Luftwaffe personnel, confirmed that German engineers had understood the Mustang's advantages, but lacked the industrial capability to develop effective responses. Dr. Heinrich Wagner, whose wartime reports had documented German technical inadequacies, told American interrogators that the laminar flow wing technology that made the P-51 so efficient had been understood theoretically by German aerodynamicists, but never successfully implemented in operational aircraft. We knew how to reduce drag through advanced wing designs, but we lacked the precision manufacturing capabilities to build wings that maintained laminar flow characteristics in operational conditions. The Americans solved engineering problems we understood theoretically, but could not overcome practically. The human dimension of technological defeat became visible in the testimony of pilots who had flown against American escorts throughout 1944. Lieutenant Hans Hartigs, who survived 83 combat missions, described the psychological impact of facing enemies who possessed advantages German pilots could not overcome. When we saw Mustangs escorting bomber formations deep over Germany, we knew the mission would be difficult and probably unsuccessful. They could stay with the bombers and fight us throughout the entire engagement. We had to conserve fuel constantly, always aware that every minute of combat reduced our margin for return to base. This mental burden affected decision-making and combat effectiveness in ways that are difficult to quantify but were absolutely real. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The legacy of the Mustang's range advantage extended beyond World War II to influence post-war aviation development and strategic thinking about air power. The recognition that long-range escort capability was essential for effective strategic bombing shaped American military doctrine through the Cold War era and into modern times. Every subsequent American fighter design included range requirements that reflected lessons learned when the P-51 eliminated the vulnerability of unescorted bombers over Europe. The German failure to develop equivalent capabilities became a case study in how industrial and technical limitations could determine strategic outcomes, regardless of tactical skill or operational courage. Luftwaffe pilots were as brave and skilled as any who fought during World War II, but they were flying aircraft that could not match American range capabilities, supported by an industrial system that was collapsing under sustained bombing, and led by commanders who denied reality until defeat became absolute. Major Klaus Fischer's final assessment, delivered during a 1973 interview for a German television documentary, captured the essential truth that German pilots acknowledged but their leaders would not accept. "We admitted among ourselves, long before the war ended, that the Americans had range we could not match. Their Mustangs could escort bombers to any target in Germany and still have fuel to fight us." This single capability, more than any other factor, defeated the Luftwaffe and allowed the strategic bombing campaign that destroyed German industry. We flew against them knowing we would lose, but we flew anyway because surrender was not an option we could consider until the very end. The mathematical certainty of defeat that Fischer described manifested in statistics that documented the complete reversal of aerial combat dynamics between 1943 and 1945. German fighter strength over the Reich, which had peaked at approximately 2,000 operational aircraft in early 1944, declined to fewer than 300 by war's end despite increased production. The difference was losses, both in combat and through mechanical failures, fuel shortages, and the elimination of experienced pilots who could not be replaced with equivalently skilled aviators. The final air battles over Germany in Fallujah. April 1945 were one-sided slaughters where American fighters outnumbered German defenders by ratios exceeding 10-1, and the few Luftwaffe pilots who still flew combat missions faced enemies who possessed every advantage in numbers, training, equipment, and operational flexibility. The Mustang's range capability, which had seemed like a technical curiosity when first reported by German intelligence in late 1943, had proven to be the decisive technological advantage that enabled American air superiority and ensured Allied victory in the air war over Europe.